The bridge of the TFS Vigilant was quiet, except for the soft hum of computers and the occasional beep from the control panels, and Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair, reading the message that had just arrived, and he read it once then, twice, and then a third time because he wanted to make sure he understood what he was seeing. And the message was from an alien species called the Crethians, and they were not being friendly at all, and the holographic display in front of him showed an alien with 4 eyes and a body covered in hard scales like armor. And the alien's name was Ambassador Thexnar, and he spoke with a voice that the computer translated into flat, emotionless English. And the ambassador said that humans had exactly 72 hours to leave this part of space, and he said the Crethian Empire had claimed these territories for 3,000 years, and that human presence here was illegal, and an insult to galactic law, and the ambassador seemed very sure of himself, like he expected the humans to just pack up and run away. Scared, Lieutenant Amy Patterson looked up from her tactical station and raised one eyebrow, and she glanced at Captain Morrison with an expression that clearly said she thought this whole thing was ridiculous, and Morrison almost smiled, but he kept his face neutral, because he was the captain, and he had to act professional, even when aliens were making silly demands, and he said to Commander Greg Lewis to bring up the survey data they had collected last month, and Lewis tapped his console, and suddenly a 3-dimensional map appeared next to the ambassador's message, and the map showed all the work humans had done in this sector for the past 15 years, and there were markers showing where they had explored and surveyed and built mining operations and research stations, and everything was documented and legal according to galactic law. Ensign Nicole Harper, who handled communications, asked if she should write a response, and Morrison said not yet because he wanted to see how this situation would develop, and he told her to contact Admiral Chen at Fleet Command because he thought the Admiral would find this whole thing very amusing. And across the sector, the same thing was happening on other human ships because the Crethians had sent the same threatening message to every human vessel in the area, and the Crethians had recently conquered 2 smaller alien civilizations, and apparently they thought humans would be just as easy to push around because humans were relatively new to space travel compared to older species. And the Crethians did not know that humans had been in these sectors for more than 10 years, quietly building and mapping, and following all the proper rules, and humans had filed all the correct paperwork with the Galactic Council, and even invited other species to verify their claims, and everything was legal and proper. On another ship called the TFS Defiant Captain, Helen Price read the same ultimatum, and she actually laughed out loud because the whole thing seemed so absurd, and she asked her tactical officer, Lieutenant Chris Baker, how many Crethian ships were nearby, and Baker checked his screens and said there were 15 capital ships with standard weapons that were about as powerful as the previous generation of human technology, and Price smiled when she heard previous generation, because that meant the Crethians were already behind, and she asked how many human ships could reach this area within 3 days, and Baker said 47 combat vessels plus the defense platforms that humans had secretly installed last year, and Price said the platforms were good because the Crethians did not know about them, and that would be a nice surprise. Back on the Vigilant, Admiral Susan Chen's face appeared on the main screen, and the Admiral was in her 50s with sharp gray eyes that had seen many situations like this before, and right now those eyes were sparkling with barely hidden amusement, and she said she assumed Morrison had read the Crethian demands, and Morrison said yes, all 3 pages of them, and Chen said she had received identical messages from 11 other captains in the last hour, and the Crethian High Command seemed to think humans would just leave without a fight, and Morrison asked permission to speak freely, and Chen granted it, and Morrison asked if the Crethians had any idea what they were walking into, and Chen smiled in a way that suggested trouble for the Crethians, and she said they had no idea at all, and she had been reviewing Crethian tactical doctrine, and it was very impressive if you were fighting wars 300 years ago because the Crethians relied heavily on having more ships than their enemy, and on scaring their opponents into surrendering. Morrison said the Crethians had probably never faced an opponent who actually fought back with modern weapons, and Chen agreed, and said that was exactly the problem. And she told Morrison what to do, and she said all human ships should stay where they were and continue normal operations, and if the Crethians wanted these sectors, they would have to come and take them by force. And Morrison asked what would happen when the Crethians actually showed up. And Chen said then humans would show the Krethians why challenging humanity was a very bad idea. But she also said to keep the response proportional because humans were not trying to start a major war, and they just wanted to teach a lesson about respecting other species and their legal territorial claims. Morrison asked about rules of engagement, and Chen said to defend themselves in human installations and to show the Krethians what human ships could do, but to try not to completely humiliate them because the whole galactic community would be watching. And when the transmission ended, Morrison turned to his crew, and every face showed the same calm professionalism, mixed with eager anticipation, because they all knew what was coming. And Morrison asked Patterson how long until the Krethian fleet would arrive, and she checked her calculations and said approximately 60 hours, based on standard Krethian fleet speeds, and Morrison said good because that gave them time to prepare. He told Lewis to coordinate with the other ships and to power up the defense platforms, but keep them in stealth mode so the Krethians would not detect them. And he also wanted sensor buoys deployed throughout the sector so humans would know exactly where every Krethian ship was at all times, and he asked someone to get him all available information about Krethian military psychology, because if they were going to teach the Krethians a lesson, they might as well make it memorable. And Harper asked if they should respond to the ultimatum, and Morrison thought for a moment, and then smiled and said yes. They should send a brief message telling the Krethians that humans had received their transmission and were reviewing it with appropriate consideration. And Harper asked if that was all, and Morrison said yes, that was all, because he wanted the Krethians to wonder what humans were thinking. As the crew got to work, Morrison looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, and somewhere out there, a Krethian admiral was probably feeling very proud of himself for intimidating the primitive humans, and in less than 3 days that admiral was going to learn a very important lesson about underestimating Earth and the human crews across the sector, shared knowing glances and subtle smiles, because they had all heard stories from Earth's history about bullies who picked the wrong fight, and the Krethians were about to become another chapter in that long tradition. On the surface of Research Station Delta, Dr. Paul Gardner received an evacuation advisory telling him to leave the station because of the Krethian threat, and he read it and chuckled and sent back a single-word response that said declined, and his assistant, Dr. Karen White, looked up from her work with alien biology samples and asked if they were really not evacuating. And Gardner said the fleet told them they were safer staying at the station than trying to move through space, while there was tension, and besides, the defense grid around the station could probably handle anything the Krethians might throw at them. And Karen asked if they should be worried, and Gardner smiled and said if he were a Krethian, he would be very worried, but humans were fine. Across human-controlled space, similar conversations were happening everywhere, and miners continued working, and researchers stayed at their posts, and transport ships kept to their regular schedules, and humanity was not retreating or even flinching, and the Krethian Empire had issued its challenge expecting fear or submission or at most some desperate negotiations. But what they were about to get was something entirely different, and the clock was ticking with 60 hours remaining until the Krethian fleet would arrive. The Krethian war fleet emerged from hyperspace with 23 capital ships arranged in perfect formation, and their hulls were painted with the crimson and gold colors of the Imperial banner. And at the center of the formation was the flagship called Unbreakable Will, which carried Grand Admiral Zexthar, who had won 12 campaigns and conquered 4 different species. And on the bridge of his flagship, Zexthar looked at the tactical display with satisfaction, and his 4 eyes surveyed the situation, and he felt confident because he had more ships and centuries of military tradition on his side. And he asked his tactical officer about the status of human forces, and the officer reported that approximately 15 human vessels had been detected, and they were maintaining positions around their facilities with no signs of evacuation. And Zexthar clicked his mandibles together in what his species considered a smile, and he said the humans were foolish to think their small number of ships could stand against the might of the Empire. Aboard the TFS Vigilant, Captain Morrison watched the Krethian fleet arrive with the calm confidence of someone holding all the winning cards, and he said the Krethians were right on time, and Commander Lewis reported that the Roosevelt Battle Group had just entered the sector and they were holding position in the asteroid field running silent, and the Krethians had not detected them yet, and Morrison said excellent, and asked about the defense platforms. And Lewis said all 36 platforms, were online and tracking targets but still in stealth mode so the Krethians could not see them. And Lieutenant Patterson looked up from tactical and said there was an incoming transmission from the Krethian flagship on an open channel, and Morrison told her to put it through because he wanted to hear what the Krethian admiral had to say. Zexathar's image filled the main screen, and his translator created a deep voice that was clearly meant to sound intimidating, and he said he was Grand Admiral Zexathar of the Krethian Imperial Fleet, and that the humans had ignored the lawful claim to this territory, and now they had 48 minutes to power down their vessels and prepare to be escorted out of Imperial space. And he said failure to comply would result in immediate seizure of human ships and destruction of their installations. And Morrison glanced around his bridge and saw that Ensign Harper had her hand over her mouth, clearly trying not to laugh, and Commander Lewis was shaking his head with an amused expression. And Morrison asked his crew for their thoughts, and Patterson said the Admiral was serious, because Krethian weapons were charging, and they actually thought they were going to capture human ships. Lewis said something about the asteroid field, and how the Krethians had positioned their fleet with their backs to it, and he said that was a tactical mistake. And Patterson agreed, and said if humans were hostile, they could use that positioning against the Krethians. And Morrison nodded and told Harper to open a response channel, because they should be diplomatic about this situation. And Harper opened the channel, and Morrison spoke directly to the Krethian admiral and said that humans appreciated the concern about territorial boundaries, but human claims to this sector were properly filed with the Galactic Council and had been validated for over a decade, and humans had no intention of abandoning their legal operations or their citizens stationed here, and perhaps they could arrange a meeting to discuss this misunderstanding. Across the sector, similar polite responses came from other human captains, and each response was calm and professional and completely unbothered by the threat of overwhelming force. And on the Unbreakable, Will Zexthar's scales ruffled with agitation because the humans dared to refuse his demands, and his second officer, Commander Vexnall, said their intelligence had suggested humans were a passive species, and this response was unexpected, but Zexthar declared the humans were bluffing because no species faced the Imperial fleet without fear, and they would break soon enough, and he ordered his tactical officer to target the nearest human vessel and fire a warning shot across their bow to show the humans that the Krethians were serious. One of the Krethian cruisers fired a plasma bolt that streaked past the TFS Defiant, missing the ship by a calculated margin, and on the Defiant's bridge, Captain Helen Price raised an eyebrow and said that was rude, and she asked Tactical if the shot had damaged anything, and the officer said negative because the shot had passed 200 meters to port and was clearly intentional, and Price told Lieutenant Baker to return the favor and put a kinetic round right between the Krethian ship's forward gun batteries and make it close enough that their proximity sensors would scream. And Baker said aye, and fired the railgun. The railgun round left the Defiant at a significant fraction of light speed, and it passed through the space between the Krethian cruiser's main weapons, with less than 50 meters of clearance on either side, and it was close enough that the ship's collision alarms went off throughout the corridors. And on the Unbreakable, Will Zexthar watched his tactical display with growing confusion, because he asked how the humans had fired that quickly when Krethian weapons needed 17 seconds to recharge between shots, and his tactical officer reported that the round had also traveled at unprecedented velocity, and their point defense systems had barely registered it, and Zexthar insisted it was one lucky shot, though his voice carried less certainty now, and he ordered all ships to proceed with the operation and advance and prepare to disable the human vessels. The Krethian fleet began moving forward in their traditional battle wall formation, which was an intimidating sight that had broken the will of countless opponents over the centuries. And aboard the Vigilant Commander, Lewis watched their approach with a critical eye and said it was a textbook formation from around the year 2200, with overlapping fields of fire and mutual support, and it would be effective against ships that fought at visual range, but humans did not fight at visual range. And Morrison asked Patterson what the optimal engagement distance was for human weapons, and she said they could hit the Krethians accurately from their current position, and the range was 70,000 kilometers, and human missiles could reach them in 43 seconds, and railguns were instantaneous at this distance. Morrison asked about Krethian effective range, and Patterson said approximately 20,000 kilometers and maybe 30 if they did not care about accuracy. And Morrison smiled and said humans should maintain their current position and let the Crethians come to them. And across the human fleet, similar calculations were being made because the Crethians were walking into a carefully prepared kill zone, and they had no idea what was about to happen. And on Station Delta, Dr. Gardner and his team watched the tactical feed with fascination, and Gardner said the whole thing was incredible, and told Karen to look at the Crethian formation because they were clustered so tightly together. And Karen asked if that was bad, and Gardner said yes, it was bad for them because one hit could damage multiple ships, and human captains spread out for exactly that reason. On the TFS, Vigilant Captain Morrison watched the Crethian fleet advance with the patience of someone who knew victory was inevitable, and he told Harper to send a message to Admiral Chen saying the guests had arrived, and they were about to begin the demonstration, and he told all ships to keep weapons tight until the Crethians entered the engagement zone, or fired first because humans should give them every chance to reconsider their actions, and the Crethian fleet continued its advance with weapons fully charged and shields at maximum, and Grand Admiral Zexthar stood at the center of his bridge, feeling confident in his numerical superiority and centuries of military tradition. What Zexthar did not know was that 36 defense platforms were tracking every ship in his fleet, and that another 30 human warships were hiding in the asteroid field with perfect firing solutions already calculated, and the 15 human ships he could see were each capable of engaging 3 or 4 Crethian vessels simultaneously. And he was about to learn that in space combat confidence meant nothing compared to technology and training and tactical awareness, and the distance continued to close, and it went from 40,000 kilometers to 35,000, and then to 30,000. Patterson said the Crethian flagship was hailing them again, and Morrison told her to play the message, and Zexathar's voice carried a note of triumph as he said, "This was the final warning, and humans should surrender now or be destroyed." And Morrison looked around his bridge at his crew, and every face showed the same calm readiness. And he thought about all the times in human history when bullies had made similar demands, and the results were rarely what the bullies expected. And he told Harper to send one final message, using text only, and Harper said she was ready, and Morrison smiled coldly and told her to send a single word, and the word was no. The single word transmitted across the void, and it was simple and absolute, and on the unbreakable will. Zexthar stared at the translated response, and his scales rippled with rage because the humans dared to refuse him, and he shouted that all ships should open fire and destroy the humans, and the Crethian fleet unleashed a massive barrage of plasma bolts and missiles, all directed at the 15 human ships they could see, and that was when the trap sprang shut. The first indication Grand Admiral Zexthar had that something was wrong came when half his missiles simply disappeared, and one moment they were tracking toward human vessels, and the next moment they were gone in brilliant flashes of point defense fire, and Zexthar demanded to know what was happening and why their missiles were not reaching their targets, and his tactical officer's voice was tight with stress as he reported that the human ships had some form of advanced point defense, and they were destroying Crethian missiles at distances the Crethians thought impossible. And on the TFS, Vigilant Lieutenant Patterson watched her displays with satisfaction and reported that point defense was operating at 96% efficiency, and only 3 missiles had made it past the outer ring. And Morrison asked about those 3 missiles, and Patterson said they were intercepted by secondary systems, and there was no damage to any fleet assets. Morrison said good and told all ships they could fire when ready, and across the human fleet, weapons officers had been waiting for those exact words, and the response was immediate and devastating. And the Vigilance RA, Ilgan spoke first, sending tungsten penetrators downrange at velocities that made them nearly impossible to evade, and each round carried kinetic energy equivalent to a tactical nuclear weapon, and they were guided by targeting systems that could track a golf ball at 1,000 kilometers. And the first Crethian cruiser never saw what hit it, because the railgun round punched through its forward shields like they were not even there, and continued through the bow armor, and exited through the engineering section, and the ship did not explode dramatically but simply stopped functioning, as every critical system along the round's path ceased to exist. Patterson reported a direct hit on Cruiser 7, and the target was disabled, and Morrison ordered the next target, and 3 more railgun rounds fired in rapid succession, and 3 more Crethian ships went dark. But the railguns were just the opening act, because from the TFS Defiant, Captain Price ordered a full missile spread and told her crew to show the Creathians what real guided weapons looked like, and 20 missiles erupted from the Defiant's launching bays, and each one was a marvel of human engineering, and they did not fly in straight lines like Creathian weapons, and instead they jinked and weaved using sophisticated artificial intelligence to predict and evade defensive fire, and some carried electronic warfare packages that jammed enemy sensors, and others had kinetic warheads designed to punch through. Shields and a few were equipped with cluster munitions that could engage multiple targets. The Creathian point defense systems were designed to track slower and more predictable missiles, and they struggled to keep up, and out of 20 missiles their guns only destroyed 6, and the remaining 14 found their marks, and explosions bloomed across the Creathian formation as missile after missile slammed home, and shields flickered and failed, and armor plating buckled, and one destroyer took 3 hits in quick succession and broke apart as its reactor containment was breached. And on the unbreakable, Will alarms screamed throughout the bridge, and Zexathar gripped his command station as his ship shuddered from a near miss, and he demanded a damage report, and his officer reported that multiple ships were disabled, and they had lost 4 cruisers and 2 destroyers, and casualties were unknown. Zexathar ordered all batteries to return fire with continuous fire, and the Creathian fleet unleashed everything it had, and plasma bolts filled the space between the two forces, creating a storm of destructive energy that should have overwhelmed any opponent, and it should have. But the human ships moved like dancers, and their engines were far more responsive than Creathian designs, and they presented minimal profiles and angled their shields to deflect shots, and maintained perfect spacing to avoid hitting each other, and the few hits that connected splashed against military-grade shields that had been refined through centuries of theoretical work and decades of practical testing. And Commander Lewis reported from the Vigilant that shields were at 91%, and the plasma was less effective than they had estimated. Morrison observed that Creathian weapons were designed for close range and high volume of fire, and they had probably never fought an enemy that could engage from this distance, and he told his crew to continue firing and to target weapon systems, because they should disable the Creathian ships, not destroy them. And across the battlefield, human captains issued similar orders, because this was not about annihilation, but about demonstration, and the goal was to show the Creathians exactly how outmatched they were while minimizing casualties. But then the trap's second phase activated, and Lewis said the Roosevelt Group was requesting permission to engage, and Morrison checked his tactical display and saw that the Creathian fleet was now positioned exactly where human planners had predicted, with their retreat route blocked by the asteroid field. They had ignored. Morrison told Commander Griffin he was cleared to engage, but rules of engagement remained the same, which meant disable, don't destroy. And in the asteroid field, 30 human warships that had been running silent suddenly came to life, and their targeting systems locked onto the Creathian fleet's rear elements, and they opened fire simultaneously, and the Creathian formation, which was already reeling from the frontal assault, now found themselves caught in a crossfire, and ships that had been trying to maneuver forward to close the range suddenly had to worry about threats from behind, and Vexenal shouted on the unbreakable Will's bridge that they were surrounded, and asked where these ships had come from. And Zexathar stared at his tactical display in disbelief, because the confident fleet strength advantage he had relied on had evaporated. The humans had more ships than his intelligence had suggested, and they had better weapons and superior tactics, and had clearly been planning this engagement for some time, and Zexathar ordered his fleet to pull back and reform because they needed distance, but there was nowhere to go because the asteroids blocked their rear, and the human ships controlled every other vector, and the Creathians were trapped in a killing zone of humanity's design. And then the third surprise revealed itself, and Patterson said with surprise in her voice, despite her training, that she was detecting weapons fire from the asteroid field itself. And those were not asteroids, but defense platforms. 36 automated weapons platforms, each positioned months ago and camouflaged to blend with natural rocks, added their fire to the engagement, and their targeting was surgical as they picked off damaged Creathian ships' weapon systems with frightening precision. And on Station Delta, Dr. Gardner watched the battlefield with something approaching awe, and he told Karen to look at the targeting patterns, because the humans were not even trying to destroy the Creathian ships, and they were systematically disabling every vessel. And Karen shook her head in amazement and asked how long the fleet had been planning this, and Gardner guessed it was from the moment the Crethians started making noise about territorial claims, because the fleet did not leave things to chance. Back in the fight, Grand Admiral Zexthar faced a decision no proud warrior wanted to make, because his fleet was being methodically dismantled, and 12 ships were already disabled, floating as hulks with no weapons or propulsion, and the remaining vessels were taking fire from 3 directions and could not effectively return it, and his communication officer spoke with a trembling voice and said they were being hailed by the human fleet, and Zexthar told him to put it on screen. And Captain Morrison's face appeared and his expression was neutral, but his eyes were hard, and he said that Grand Admiral Zexthar should know this engagement could end at any time, and if the Crethians powered down their weapons and shields, the humans would cease fire, and disabled ships would be towed to a safe distance and wounded would receive medical attention, or the Crethians could continue fighting and humans would disable every ship in the fleet, and the choice was theirs. Zexthar's mandibles ground together in frustration and humiliation because every instinct screamed at him to continue the fight and to die with honor rather than surrender. But he looked at his tactical display and saw the ships under his command being systematically picked apart, and he saw the casualty reports streaming in, and he knew what he had to do, and he asked Morrison what would happen to his crew if they surrendered, and Morrison said simply that they would go home, because this did not have to be a massacre, and humans were trying to make a point, not start a war, and the word stung worse than any weapon, because the humans were not even taking this seriously, and this was not a battle to them but a teaching moment. Zexthar took a deep breath and ordered all ships to cease fire and power down weapons and shields, and across the Crethian fleet ships went dark one by one, and the sudden silence after the fury of combat was almost deafening, and on the vigilant Morrison nodded and told all ships to cease fire and ordered Lewis to organize recovery operations for disabled Crethian vessels, and told medical teams to stand by, and he looked at the view screen at the drifting Crethian ships and the intact human fleet, and told Harper to send a message to Admiral Chen saying the demonstration was successful with 0 casualties on the human side and minimal on the Crethian side, and the captain stood and gazed out at the aftermath of the shortest war in galactic history, and the Crethians had learned a hard lesson today, and the question was whether they would learn the right one. The medical bay of the TFS Vigilant was busy with activity as Terran medics worked alongside their Crethian counterparts, and the scene would have been unthinkable 6 hours ago with humans and Crethians working together to treat the wounded from the brief, brutal engagement, and Dr. Paul Gardner had been brought up from Station Delta specifically for this, because his expertise in alien biology made him invaluable for treating the more seriously wounded Crethians, and he moved between beds with his practiced eye assessing injuries while human medics followed his instructions, and he told Lieutenant Lisa Monroe, who was one of the Vigilance medical officers, that one patient had a fractured carapace segment, and it was like a broken rib for Crethians, and they needed to stabilize it before moving him. Monroe nodded as she prepared the equipment and said their anatomy was fascinating, because the redundant circulatory systems probably saved a lot of lives today. And Gardner said quietly, that was the point, because Captain Morrison was not trying to kill anyone but just disable ships, and in the ship's conference room, a very different kind of healing was underway, and Captain Morrison sat across from Grand Admiral Zexthar with Commander Lewis and Captain Price joining via holographic link, and also present, much to the Crethians' surprise, was Ambassador Marcus Webb, who was humanity's senior diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council. Zexthar looked diminished without his elaborate uniform as he sat in the plain gray ship suit the humans had provided, and his 4 eyes moved between the human officers, trying to understand these creatures who had defeated him so soundly, yet treated his wounded with such care, and he finally said he did not understand why humans had not destroyed his fleet when they had the capability, and his people would have destroyed the humans if the situation was reversed. And Ambassador Webb leaned forward with his weathered face kind but firm, and said that destruction was not the objective, because understanding was the objective. Zexthar asked what he meant by understanding, and Webb said the Admiral had come here believing humans were weak and easily intimidated, and he expected humans to run or submit, but instead he discovered humans were neither weak nor easily frightened, but more importantly, humans discovered something about the Crethian Empire, And Morrison picked up the explanation and said that Krethian tactics were centuries old, and the Admiral's formation was perfect for fighting wars against opponents who used similar technology and doctrine. But it was completely wrong for fighting humans. Price added from her holographic display that they had been studying intelligence reports, and the Krethian Empire had not faced a peer opponent in 300 years, and every species the Krethians had encountered was either technologically inferior or culturally predisposed to submission, and Zexthar's scales rippled, which was a sign of discomfort, and he admitted this was true because the Krethians were, or had been, the dominant military power in this region. And Webb said gently that the Admiral should notice he used past tense because humanity was not interested in becoming enemies with the Krethian Empire. But humans were also not going to be intimidated or displaced from territory they legally claimed, and had developed Zexithar started to say something about the sector councils. But Morrison interrupted and said the human claims were filed 15 years ago and verified by 3 different galactic authorities, and humans followed every protocol. And the Krethian Empire's claim was based on ancient history, not current law. And Lewis brought up a holographic display showing the relevant documentation and said they had 17 different surveys and resource assessments and development plans all properly registered and approved, and the Krethian government should have known this before sending a fleet. Zexithar was silent for a long moment, and finally said in a bitter voice that his government did know, or they should have known, because he was told the humans were illegally occupying Imperial territory, and he was told humans were primitives who had stumbled into space travel and did not understand galactic law, and Price said bluntly that someone had lied to him, and the question was why. And Ambassador Webb nodded and said they had been doing some investigation while Krethian ships were being repaired, and the Krethian Empire had some internal political dynamics that humans were not previously aware of, and it appeared there was a faction that wanted to expand aggressively to reclaim the Empire's ancient glory, and they needed victories to maintain political support. Zexthar said with understanding dawning in his voice that humans were supposed to be an easy victory and a primitive species to conquer, which would be proof that the Empire was strong again, and Webb confirmed this was exactly right. But now that plan had fallen apart, and the Krethian government had a choice to make because they could acknowledge what happened here and admit they made a mistake and establish proper diplomatic relations with humanity, or they could double down and send a bigger fleet and lose even more spectacularly. Morrison leaned back in his chair and said the Admiral seemed like a competent officer who was given bad intelligence and worse orders, and he did what he thought was right, but he needed to understand something about humanity. And Zexithar asked what that was, and Morrison said humans had been fighting wars for their entire history, including wars of conquest and wars of survival, and wars over ideas and resources and territory, and humans had gotten very, very good at fighting, and they had also gotten good at ending wars and finding peace and building alliances with former enemies. Price added that the technology the Krethians saw today was not cutting edge for humans because it was standard fleet equipment, and humans had weapons and ships they did not deploy because they were not necessary. And Zexthar asked with disbelief in his voice if humans were saying they had held back, and Lewis said of course they held back, because if humans wanted to destroy the Krethian fleet, they could have done it in the first 30 seconds, and every ship would have taken multiple railgun rounds before Krethian computers even registered the attack. The Krethian admiral sat back processing this information because everything he had believed about his empire's military supremacy was crumbling, and he asked quietly what would happen now, and Ambassador Webb smiled and said, now they would talk and really talk, because Krethian ships would be repaired and allowed to return home, and the wounded were being cared for, and humans would provide complete after-action reports showing exactly what happened and why. And they would open formal diplomatic channels with the Krethian government. Zexithar said his government might not listen, and Morrison said then humans would be ready if the Krethians sent another fleet. But humans were hoping the Krethian leadership was smart enough to learn from this, and Zexthar asked what would happen to him personally, because he had failed and lost ships under his command, and Price corrected him and said he had not failed because he survived an impossible situation, and he had the wisdom to stop fighting when continuing would only have gotten more of his people killed. And that was not failure, but leadership in the medical bay. Dr. Gardner finished treating his last patient and found himself approached by the Krethian chief medical officer, who was a female named Thexara, and she said through her translator that human medical technology was impressive, as was the willingness to use it on those who had attacked them. And Gardner shrugged and said they were doctors and they treated patients and the species or nationality of patients did not matter. And Thexara said this was not how wars were typically fought in the galaxy, and Gardner said with no offense intended to her species or the Empire. But maybe that was part of the problem. Thexara's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement, and she said perhaps he was correct, and asked if she could ask him a question. And Gardner said of course, and Thexara asked if humans were so advanced and so capable. Why had they not sought to conquer others, and why were humans content with their small territories? And Gardner considered the question carefully, and said humans learned the hard way, that conquest did not bring prosperity or security, but brought resentment and resistance and endless conflict. And humans tried the Empire thing back in their history, and tried it multiple times, and it never ended well. Thexara asked if humans chose peace, and Gardner said humans chose cooperation, because trade was more profitable than tribute, and allies were more reliable than subjects, and discoveries shared between species advanced everyone faster than secrets hoarded by one. And Thexara said it was a strange philosophy for such a powerful species, and Gardner admitted it was maybe strange, but it worked for humans. And honestly, after today, maybe the Krethian Empire should consider it too back. In the conference room, the meeting was concluding, and Ambassador Webb said formally that he would be traveling back with the Krethian fleet to present Earth's formal diplomatic credentials to the Krethian government, and they would negotiate proper boundaries and trade agreements and hopefully establish a foundation for peaceful coexistence. And Zexthar asked what would happen if his government refused, and Morrison said flatly that they would face the consequences of their choices. But humans were hoping it would not come to that because war was expensive and destructive and ultimately pointless. When diplomatic solutions existed, Zexthar stood and his posture straightened, and he said that he came here to conquer humans. But instead, humans had conquered his certainty, and he would report honestly to his superiors about what happened here, and whether they listened was beyond his control. And Morrison said that was all anyone could ask. And as the Krethian officer was escorted out, Price's hologram turned to Morrison and asked if he thought the Krethians would learn, and Morrison replied that the smart ones would, and the others would send another fleet, and humans would teach the same lesson again. 3 weeks after what was already being called the 3-hour war, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and the Grand Chamber was carved from a single massive crystal and orbited a neutral star, and it was filled with representatives from 47 different species, and the ambient translators hummed constantly, rendering dozens of languages into forms each species could understand. And Ambassador Marcus Webb stood at the human podium, flanked by holographic displays, showing footage from the engagement. And he had been speaking for 20 minutes, carefully explaining humanity's position, and he concluded by saying that Earthform Ally requested the Galactic Council review the Krethian Empire's territorial claims and confirm humanity's legal right to the disputed sectors, and he believed the evidence spoke for itself. Councillor Threnvik, who was a towering crystalline being, serving as the Council's arbiter, shimmered as he spoke and said the Council had reviewed human documentation, and the claims were indeed properly filed and validated, but the Krethian Empire's representative had requested to address the body, and they would hear him now. And the Krethian ambassador, who was a different individual from Admiral Zexthar, but with the same four-eyed appearance, approached his podium, and his posture was stiff, and his scales were dull, which humans had learned, indicated shame. The Krethian ambassador began by saying, "The Empire acknowledged that errors were made in the recent incident with the human fleet, and their military command operated on incomplete intelligence regarding the legal status of the disputed sectors, and furthermore their assessment of human military capabilities was severely flawed," and murmurs rippled through the chamber because this was not the proud, aggressive stance the Krethians typically took. And the ambassador continued, saying that after reviewing evidence provided by the Terran fleet, including complete tactical recordings, they must concede that humanity's claims to the disputed territories were legitimate, and they also must acknowledge that their attempt to forcibly remove humans was both legally unjustified and tactically inadvisable. Webb kept his expression neutral, but he was impressed because someone in the Krethian government had decided that honesty was the best policy, and probably someone who had read Admiral Zexthar's report and realized that further conflict would end badly, and the Krethian ambassador said with a weight in his voice that silenced the chamber that the Empire formally withdrew all claims to the disputed sectors and recognized human sovereignty over their legally occupied territories, and they also extended an invitation to Earth to begin formal diplomatic and trade negotiations. The chamber erupted in a dozen different forms of surprise because species that communicated through light flashed brilliant colors, and those with vocal capabilities buzzed or chirped or exclaimed, and the crystalline counselor had to pulse 3 times to restore order, and Threnvik said this was unexpected and asked if Earth accepted this proposal, and Webb replied that pending review of specific terms, yes, because Earth had no desire for ongoing conflict with the Krethian Empire, and humans entered space to explore and learn and build relationships, not to make enemies. Another counselor, who was a serpentine being named Cicera, spoke up and said, if she may, this incident raised larger questions, because the humans had demonstrated military capabilities that exceeded most species in this sector, and should the Council not be concerned about this new power? And Webb had been expecting this question and said that humanity's military capabilities existed because of their history, and humans came from a world where conflict was common and where survival required constant innovation, and they developed advanced weapons because they needed them. But they also developed diplomacy and trade and art and science and cooperation for the same reason. Webb gestured to the holographic displays, changing them to show not battle footage but images of Earth with cities glittering under orbital lights and ships engaged in peaceful trade and research stations shared with other species and agricultural platforms feeding billions, and he said humans were capable of war, but preferred peace, and they would defend themselves and their citizens vigorously as they demonstrated with the Krethian fleet, but they were not interested in conquest or domination, and there was a human saying that the best weapon was the one you never had to fire. Another counselor observed that humans had fired quite effectively, and Webb countered that they only fired after exhausting diplomatic options because the Krethian Empire issued an ultimatum, and humans offered to negotiate, but the Krethians chose to attack and humans chose to defend themselves while minimizing casualties on both sides, and if humans wanted to be aggressive, Admiral Zexthar's fleet would have been destroyed, not disabled and repaired, and this caused another stir because the concept of deliberately choosing not to destroy an enemy who had attacked first was foreign to many species. Present, Counselor Threnvik pulsed thoughtfully and said the Council acknowledged humanity's restraint, but this incident had revealed a significant military disparity in this sector, and other species might feel threatened, and Webb said carefully that perhaps this was an opportunity for dialogue, because Earth was willing to share defensive technology with allied species, and humans were also willing to discuss mutual defense agreements and trade partnerships and cultural exchanges, and they wanted to be part of the galactic community, not apart from it. Meanwhile, back in human-controlled space, the incident's effects were already rippling outward, and on Station Delta, Dr. Gardner found himself hosting an unprecedented number of visitors because scientists from 6 different species had requested to visit his biology labs, and they were suddenly very interested in collaborating with the humans who had so thoroughly defeated the Krethian Empire, and a visiting researcher named Vrax from the Quillian Confederation said that human medical technology was remarkable, and the care humans provided to wounded Krethians who were their enemies spoke highly of their civilization's values. Gardner smiled as he showed Virax around the facility and said, humans had a long history of battlefield medicine, unfortunately, but yes, they believed that healing transcended conflict, and even enemies could become friends if given the chance, and Vrax said the Quillian government was very interested in establishing formal relations with humanity, particularly after seeing how humans handled the Krethian situation, and Gardner asked if it was because humans were efficient, but not cruel, and Vrax said precisely because it suggested humans were powerful but not aggressive, and that was a rare combination. Across the sector, similar conversations were happening because species that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence were suddenly requesting meetings and proposing trade agreements and suggesting collaborative research projects, and the 3-hour war had announced humanity's presence on the galactic stage in a way that decades of diplomatic overtures never could have. And aboard the TFS Vigilant, now back on routine patrol, Captain Morrison reviewed reports from across human space, and merchant ships were reporting new trade inquiries, and scientific outposts were getting collaboration requests, and the diplomatic corps was overwhelmed with meeting requests. Commander Lewis observed while reading over Morrison's shoulder that humans had become interesting, and Morrison corrected him, saying they had become useful because there was a difference, and species were reaching out because they saw humans as potential allies or trading partners, not because they were fascinated by human culture. And Lewis said that was how most alliances started, with mutual benefit before mutual understanding, and Morrison admitted that was a fair point. Lieutenant Patterson looked up from her station and said there was an incoming message from Admiral Chen requesting a real-time conference, and Morrison told her to put it through, and Admiral Chen appeared on the main screen, and Morrison could tell immediately that something significant had happened, because the Admiral's expression was carefully neutral, which was the look she wore when dealing with complicated situations, and she said the Galactic Council had made an interesting proposal requesting that Earth provide military advisors to help other species modernize their defensive capabilities. Morrison blinked in surprise and asked if they wanted humans to train potential opponents, and Chen corrected him, saying they wanted humans to help create a more balanced security environment. And the Council's logic was that if everyone had comparable defensive capabilities, there was less incentive for species like the Krethians to attempt aggressive expansion, and Morrison asked if humans were supposed to give away their tactical advantages, and Chen assured him not the cutting-edge technology, but basic doctrine and training methodologies and defensive strategies, and she told him to think of it as galactic community policing. Morrison asked if that made humans the beat cops, and Chen smiled slightly and said more like the training academy. But yes, essentially. And the question was whether Earth should accept, because it would commit significant resources and personnel, but it could also establish Earth as a key player in galactic security, and Morrison considered carefully and said if humans did this, they needed to be selective and only share with species that demonstrated genuine defensive intent, and they needed safeguards to ensure the technology and training was not misused. Chen agreed and said she was putting together a proposal and asked Morrison how he would feel about leading the initial assessment team. And Morrison asked why him and Chen said he had demonstrated both tactical excellence and diplomatic restraint. And he was also the officer who defeated the Krethian fleet without destroying it, and that made him uniquely qualified. And Morrison glanced at his crew, and Patterson gave him a subtle nod, and Lewis shrugged in a gesture that said, "Why not?" Morrison said, all right, he would do it, but he wanted Lewis and Patterson on his team, and Chen granted the request and told him to report to Earth Station 1 in 2 weeks for briefing and planning. And she said this was important because how humans handled this could shape human-galactic relations for centuries, and Morrison said no. Pressure then. And Chen smiled and said he was human, and pressure was when he did his best work. On the Krethian homeworld, Grand Admiral Zexthar stood before the Imperial High Council, making his full report, and the ornate chamber was filled with the Empire's most powerful leaders, and their attention was focused entirely on him. And he concluded by saying he must inform the Council that humans were not a species to be trifled with, and their military capabilities exceeded Krethian capabilities by a significant margin, and more importantly, their tactical doctrine and strategic thinking operated on principles the Krethians had not encountered before. The High Chancellor, who was ancient and scarred from a dozen campaigns, leaned forward and asked if the Admiral was saying this young species defeated a fleet under his command, not through luck, but through superior capability. And Zexthar said yes, through superior capability, and humans anticipated Krethian movements and neutralized their advantages and demonstrated restraint even in victory, and they were formidable but not cruel, and powerful but not aggressive. And another counselor said this was troubling, because if humanity was this powerful, they could threaten the Empire. Zexthar said firmly that he did not believe that was humanity's intention, because they defeated the Krethians to make a point not to conquer. And Ambassador Webb was quite clear that Earth sought peaceful coexistence, not dominance. And the High Chancellor was quiet for a long moment and then said, perhaps the Empire had been wrong in its approach, and perhaps the old ways of conquest and subjugation no longer served them in this new age. And another shocked counselor asked what the High Chancellor meant, and the ancient leader said that peace could be as profitable as war, and far less costly in lives and resources. And if the humans offered genuine partnership, perhaps the Crethians should accept it, not from weakness, but from wisdom's Xthar, allowed himself a small measure of hope because perhaps his defeat would not be remembered as a failure. But as the moment the Crethian Empire chose a different path and, back on the Vigilant, Captain Morrison stood at his viewport, looking out at the stars, and somewhere out there, the Crethian fleet was heading home, and somewhere else dozens of species were reassessing their assumptions about humans. And throughout the galaxy, everyone was learning that humanity preferred peace, but was very, very good at war. And the difference was they were also very good at ending it.